Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. You will hear me say this again, because I say it like every third or fourth sermon. It's really good to read a big chunk of Matthew's Gospel at a time and get several stories together, because they flow one into the other. And it's hard sometimes to pull out a little piece and understand all the threads and connections that are being made there. So a couple of weeks ago, we had Feast of the Transfiguration, and because that fell on a Sunday, we missed a reading from Matthew's Gospel in course, which was the story of the feeding of the 5,000. Jesus gathers this crowd, and he heals them and teaches, and it's a Jewish crowd. And he multiplies the 5 loaves and the 2 fish. The disciples go out and feed everyone, and they gather up 12 baskets full at the end. And 12, of course, is this wonderful symbolic number in Israel for the 12 tribes, for the fullness. Everyone gets fed, and then there's enough left over, and it represents the fullness of the people of Israel. Then we have the story of Jesus walking on water and some healings. And then today, we have Jesus having engaged the Pharisees in a question about ritual purity. Our lectionary cut out a few verses at the beginning of what we said, where the Pharisees say, "Why do your disciples eat with unwashed hands?" And Jesus engages with them, and then he ends with the saying, the first verse of our passage today, about it's what comes out that defiles, out of the heart defiles, and not what goes into the mouth. He has this discussion with his disciples about what this means. Jesus apparently doesn't like to wash his hands, but it's a ritual action, right? So the Pharisees were a very well-respected group, and they were popular with the people. But one of the things they did is take certain laws that applied only to the priests who were going to temple sacrifice and say they applied to everyone. So the priests had to purify their hands before they would go and offer an animal at the altar and so on. And we have a writing from one of the early, early contemporaneous Jewish source that said something like what the Pharisees might have said. Let every table in Israel be as if it were the temple of the Lord. And so everyone was required to do this ritual hand washing. And Jesus has no concern for that. But the Pharisees are popular and beloved people, and they have been advocating for Israel for a long time. They're an important group. And so when Jesus says they are blind guides leading the blind, leave them alone, they don't know what they're talking about. It would be like if the bishop called me up and I said, I'm not going to pay any attention to that. Let it be, right? Like it's these are religious authorities who are well respected. And Jesus says, they're getting something fundamentally wrong here. And the disciples have crossed over the boat that they got on when Jesus walked on water. They've entered now into Gentile territory, which is important to note, right? We're told that this woman that comes to him today is a Canaanite, and he's in the region of Tyre and Sidon. This whole thing about Jesus saying dogs and bread and so on can be very startling, but there's a couple of pieces of background information here that I think are useful to know. Tyre, a Gentile city, had an excellent economy, but they didn't have land to grow things and would often buy their bread and grain from Galilee, from the Jewish area around them. And even in time of famine, they had, or low crops, they had the ability to basically buy bread right off of Jewish people's tables, right? And so this whole image, and they were resented for it, right? A Gentile people, the ancient enemy of Israel, who literally has the capacity to buy bread away from them when everyone is hungry. And they were routinely called dogs, right? They're rich and they've got everything and they're taking our food, and those Gentile dogs, right? So that's a kind of background image there. So Jesus has just fed the 5,000. There's this abundance of bread. We've got that story. And then he engages with this woman, or at first doesn't engage with her. He says to himself, I was sent only to the tribes of Israel. That's exactly what he told the disciples a few weeks ago when we heard the story of him sending them out. His understanding of his mission at this point was that it was to the people of Israel. God has chosen the people of Israel. God is working with the people of Israel. He feeds them abundantly, and there's 12 baskets left over, the abundance of food for the people of Israel. And then this woman comes to him. She confesses faith in him. Lord, Son of David. She speaks powerful words of faith, even though she's coming from a place where she's an ancient enemy. I was reading a sermon by the great 19th century British Baptist preacher, Charles Spurgeon. It's called The Prince of Preachers. He says that this Canaanite woman conquered Jesus. In the story of ancient Israel, Joshua, the same name as Jesus, Joshua goes in and conquers the Canaanites. But here Jesus comes into the land of Canaan, and the faith of this Canaanite woman conquers Jesus. Because she has faith. She confesses her faith. She keeps coming to him in desperation, right? Her child is in dire straits. This is the most intense feeling I think a parent can have for a child who's in so much trouble, and she's going desperately to the one who she thinks can help, and she's not going to give up. So when Jesus says, it's not right to take the children's food and give it to the dogs, she turns that around immediately in her engagement with him. And she says, even the little dogs, the Greek word here for dogs is little dogs, more like a house pet dog, not a street dog. Even the little dogs eat the crumbs from their master's table. She acknowledges that Jesus is her Lord and Master here, and she's waiting for the crumbs. But we've just had this feeding of the 5,000. We know the crumbs can fill 12 baskets full, right? She pushes back against Jesus' understanding of his mission in this moment, and he responds to her faith in an amazing way and gives her what she asks for. Her daughter is healed at that hour. He praises her faith. Our lectionary goes on to the next story, and we'll hear it next week. But Jesus feeds another large crowd, except he's in Gentile territory this time. He will feed a crowd of 4,000, but of Gentiles. And when they gather up the fragments afterwards, they gather 7 baskets full. And when you hear the list of the tribes of the Canaanites in those stories in the book of Joshua, the Hivites, the Perizzites, the Jebusites, there's 7. There's 7 tribes for the Canaanites that Israel goes in. So he's got the feeding of the 5,000 and the 12 tribes of Israel, and it's bracketed after this engagement with this Canaanite woman where he feeds Gentiles, and there's 7 baskets left over. And you have to kind of read the whole thing together to get all of these threads that are connecting. But this is a powerful moment in Jesus' ministry, because we know when we get to the end of Matthew's gospel, he says, go out and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. But up to this point, it's been, my mission is to the house of Israel. But man, doesn't he find faith in all kinds of other places? The centurion who asks for Jesus to heal his servant, this woman, and the woman who touches the fringe of his cloak. All of these people push the mission and open the mission larger and larger, till at the end Jesus says, all nations, all peoples. And those baskets, they are overflowing. Aren't they overflowing? When we take a look at our own lives and think about ourselves having been in times of desperate straits, we can go to Jesus, and we also want to conquer Jesus with our prayers when we go to ask him for those things that we desperately need. Sometimes we don't get the answer we want not right away, right? This woman calls to Jesus, and he says he said not a word to her. She keeps calling, and she keeps calling, and we also have to keep calling sometimes for the answer to our prayer, for the relief that we need, for a sense of God's grace and mercy. This story has been of particular love for Anglicans, going back to our oldest prayer books. Many of you will remember that after the priest blesses the bread and wine, after we sing the fraction anthem, there's another prayer. We do not presume to come to this thy table, O merciful Lord, trusting in our own righteousness, but in thy manifold and great mercies. We are not worthy so much as to gather up the crumbs underneath thy table. And then comes the hit, right? Then comes the great part. But thou art the same Lord whose property is always to have mercy. Thou art the same Lord whose property is always to have mercy. Grant us, therefore, gracious Lord, so to eat the flesh of thy dear Son, to drink his blood, that he may live in us and we in him. I'll pray that prayer today at the altar, and those of you who know it, you can join in, and if you want to say it with me, you can find it on page 337 of the Book of Common Prayer. But it is a powerful prayer, and when we think about ourselves seeking to conquer Jesus, knowing that we ourselves have been in dire straits, people we love are in trouble, we are in trouble. Our own sense of our own frailty and failure can bear down on us. And we are willing to go to Jesus over and over and over again until we find those crumbs that fall from the Master's table. But when you're talking about the feast of God, a crumb is as good as a loaf because the grace is so overwhelming. The grace is so powerful. We take just a wafer as an acknowledgement of the amazing, prodigal generosity of God. We know that this little wafer is the fullness of God's love for us, offered to us. She conquers Jesus. And may we also conquer Jesus with our prayers when we find ourselves in desperate need of that Lord whose only property is always to have mercy. Amen.